Last Sunday morning, like I think some of you I was listening to NPR on my way to church in the morning and before too. And I heard during the headlines, they just sort of give some of the headlines as what's happening today. And one of the stories that they read, and I heard this twice, excuse me, between, the news about Lebanon and about Iran and about local politics, they reported. And I remember this vividly because I wondered, why on earth is NPR report? Like, why is this a headline? It was that day, last Sunday, was the last day of the annual Angola State Penitentiary Rodeo. Right? I know, I see your face. There's no context about what that was or about why a prison rodeo made NPR headlines. What is a penitentiary rodeo? Who goes to it? Who competes in it? What's included? And even before I Googled it, I had that reaction like, this is weird. This is a weird thing. And then I was like sort of skeptical about what this thing could be. And then I found the website, which is sort of a fair-like illustration. It's called The Wildest Show in the South. And it includes the illustration of a white cowboy on a bucking bronco, juxtaposed, at least to me, it feels like a juxtaposition, against an illustration of a imposing brick building flanked with guard towers and barbed wire on top. That is the illustration on the front of their website. That glib tagline, the wildest show in the South, that combined with like NPR is reporting this thing, that white cowboy on the bucking bronco, it gives it this impression of like, this is a fun, fair kind of activity that you can go to with your family. And that notion, just that alone is very jarring to me. That's the impression, and I know that this is happening at a prison. And when as I'm sure most of you do, that most of the people in prisons in this country are people of color and disproportionately Black men. This, to me, like just on its face, smacked of minstrelsy, like Black people put in the situation of this rodeo. And then I found a video. And it was shocking. It's shocking to me what this event actually is. To me, it looked more like a Roman gladiator kind of situation than a rodeo. So 2 of the events that I saw video of involve Black men wearing some padding, like hockey kind of padding helmets, and some padding on their upper bodies. One event in which they're trying to get, I think, a ring off of one of the horns of the bull without getting, and the last person standing wins. And one of them is called convict poker, where 4 men sit around a card table and basically wait to be charged by these 1,000-pound animals with sharp horns and hooves. And I genuinely could not believe that this is something that people are doing for entertainment, because men are flung through the air and stomped on. And I was shocked. It was shocking to me. And meanwhile, like, these men are dressed in almost a parody of prison garb. The shirts that they are wearing are these broad black and white stripes. And I can't believe that this is happening in 2026. And then it was on NPR. What? This idea that, like, this isn't, I grew up around rodeo people. I grew up in Saskatchewan in the prairies, and I knew people who competed in, roping and riding broncos. And you train for that. You grow up around horses and you learn that life, and there are safety precautions, and it's dangerous, but you train. And these weren't men that are trained. They're men who are basically just, they go out there and their bodies are used for sport. Now, I had a vague notion of what Angola prison was. I knew it was a huge prison, and then I knew it was in the South. But what I learned, because you better believe I dove down a rabbit hole on this one, was that not only is it one of the largest prisons in the US, like many prisons and like many prisons in America, it grew out of the system of chattel slavery. And I know that probably many of you already know that when the 13th Amendment liberated enslaved people, it had a pretty big caveat that there was a carve out for those who were in prison. And I quote, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime whereof the party shall be duly convicted, shall exist within the United States." So you can't enslave people unless they're criminals, and then they just criminalize blackness, essentially. I mean, I'm making a slight exaggeration, but only very slight. So for that reason, many Black people were and are, continue to be, picked up for nominal or non-existent crimes and forced into labor. And anecdotally, so the primary video I watched about this, the interviewer talked to some of the inmates at the fair, both those who had been in the rodeo, and there's a huge sort of arts and crafts element to this fair where inmates will sell the things that they've handmade. And anecdotally, the prisoners there would say 80% or more of the people who are in prison are there who are innocent of the thing that they're charged of. And Angola prison specifically transitioned very smoothly from being a plantation into being a prison. So before it was a prison, it was a plantation where crops like cotton were grown. And to this day, prisoners, one of the first things that they do when they arrive at Angola is pick cotton. Like, to this day. Now, 2026. And so at this rodeo, they earn a nominal amount of money for performing or for being in the rodeo. So that's what motivates them to do that, is that they can earn a little bit of money because they don't, I mean, I think you earn like a couple cents or something like that for doing the jobs of like picking cotton or cleaning or cooking, like those kinds of things in prison. But they can earn a little bit of money either from selling their crafts or from being in the rodeo show. And yeah, so why did I take you all on this horrifying journey? Because as I was reading about enslavement during this week in the book of Acts, both the imprisonment of Paul, but also the captivity of the slave girl. As I often do with Acts, I turned to Willie James Jennings, who has written a commentary about Acts, and is himself a Black man. He has experience of going through life with a Black man's body. And one of the things that he said first about this story is that enslavement should haunt us. He says this about just like he said, like the slave girl was sort of, she followed Paul around, like sort of haunting him. And he says, such haunting is necessary and of the spirit, as the tormented cries of the enslaved must always encumber the pious actions of the faithful. This whole story in Paul is a story about captivity, the different kinds of captivity, and about how Jesus' disciples are called to respond to their own and to others' captivity. Neither the enslavement of that girl in the story, who was going around, and she was captive of a spirit also, and enslaved by human owners, neither her captivity nor the capture of Paul can be disentangled from commodification, from wealth and money and power, and how those keep us captive, how those are utilized for making greater, more power, exchanging wealth, exercising power over others. Both of those are all that's tangled up together in this story. When Willie James Jennings talks about prison, he says, just as it is now, prison is a tool of those in power. People with wealth and people with power, and usually they're the same, avoid prison themselves, and they deploy it against people who do not have wealth or power. So the girl in this story, just like the inmates of Angola today, she is being commodified. Her body is being used to make money for people who already have wealth, and they are building their wealth through her. She is a prophet, and she makes a profit for the people who enslave her, of which there are multiple. To me, that brought to mind the way multiple people can own like a racehorse, the horse races, and multiple owners can make money off of this one animal. To them, she is an animal. And then when the prophet is lost, those same powerful people turn their attention and their anger onto Paul because he was the one who caused them to lose their moneymaker. So in the same way that if Paul had injured their racehorse, now he is legally responsible for recompense to them. And whether or not he pays it, the result is they're angry, he's accused, he loses his freedom. So I'm going to come back to Paul's captivity in a moment. But before I do that, I want to talk about the significant differences between that girl and Paul. Part of the reason I was so taken in by this story in the first place was that the girl herself, I learned that nearly half of young women, so half of young women at that time were enslaved in some manner or other. So people the age of like the young women in our group right here, half of them were in enslavement in some form or other. So like this girl had a prophet, like a spirit, she was prophesying, but household duties, many other kinds of trafficking. And her situation was so intriguing to me, but the narrative is so opaque about what happened to her afterward. There's no mention of her after Paul frees her of this spirit. We just know she annoyed Paul by following him around. He's annoyed. He casts out the spirit. And then we hear nothing else. What happened? Come on, author of Luke, just tell us what happened. So many questions about what happened to her. Some scholars think, and this was, I think, if I had thought about what my assumption was, is that Paul freed her of a demon. It was a demon that possessed her, and that's if he liberated her of this demon, we should celebrate this. But it was not an evil spirit. If anything, it was neutral to good, because she is proclaiming Paul's mission. She's calling out before him, bringing attention to the gospel of Christ. And then some scholars say, and what I suspect is true, is that now that this demon has left her, she no longer has the ability to make money for her human owners, and would not her enslavement that she doesn't. Well, they wouldn't free her. Why would they free her? I think probably what would be more likely is her enslavement would become worse. She would be trafficked into even worse kinds of captivity. Her body used in ways that were even more harmful to her. How can Paul, a disciple of Jesus Christ, have done this so callously to a child of God? Such a vulnerable person. So these are the questions that I'm living with this week. I know Paul is problematic, but what? So again, big rabbit hole on this one. I actually read 3 books. What I want to think happened is what Acts scholar Ivone Richter-Reimer, who's a pastor and a theologian from Brazil, suggests as a possibility. Do you know her? Okay. What she suggests this is a possibility, but by no means a given. She says that because all of the events of this are described as happening on the way to a place of prayer, that in her view, this is a Jewish gathering place that Paul and Silas are on their way to. And that when Paul just out of his annoyance, releases this girl from her spirit. That might have meant freeing her into the Jewish community of which Lydia was a part. So we hear a little bit about Lydia at the end, but her story comes before this one. And Reimer thinks that maybe what happened is that when this girl was liberated of that spirit, she was then taken into the care of the Jewish community that was with them. Apparently, there is evidence in the historical record that the Jewish community in Philippi did buy the freedom of other slaves. And that when Paul freed her from that prophetic spirit, and he legally owed the enslavers money because he lost them money, that could have been the result, is that that girl then entered into that Jewish community of Jesus followers. And this is my speculation, but if that's true, that could have been part of the reason then why the accusation against him was he's Jewish and he's a troublemaker. That it wasn't about, they didn't accuse him of losing them money, but that was implicit because the Jewish community had already been taking slaves out of the system and buying their freedom. Regardless of whether Paul's intention was to liberate, even if it was motivated by his annoyance first, or whether this is a thoughtless act of self-preservation on his part that leads to her suffering. Either way, it is an opportunity to examine how we are called to discipleship. One of the biblical commenters that I follow says that when biblical characters don't act the way we think they should, or when they don't act the way we want them to act, that is an opportunity for us to think about how we would act or how we are called to act in their place. Because we all know that Paul is not perfect. We've talked about that in Sunday school. I've talked about that many times from this pulpit. Paul is not perfect, but what I will give him is this. When he does end up in prison, he does give us an example that we can follow, I think. Unlike the girl, and unlike all the inmates in Angola prison now, Paul's sojourn into prison is somewhat out of choice. Paul has a lot of privilege in this situation, and that allows him to navigate the world in a way that girl could never, that many of the Black men who are in Angola prison could never. Paul is a Roman citizen, and he could have immediately deployed that fact. He could have played the I'm a Roman citizen card immediately when he was being taken into custody. Because he has the same status and the same situation as those who were accusing him. He also is a Roman citizen. He's not just a Jewish troublemaker. He is that, but he is also a Roman citizen. And somehow, in that combination of identities, one of them being a disciple of Jesus Christ, that discipleship gives him some courage. It makes him sort of fearless. He goes to prison not caring what could happen to his body. And he stays in prison even when he could have escaped. He uses that opportunity, the opportunity of the earthquake, as an opportunity for ministry. But not just an opportunity for ministry, as an opportunity to expose the injustice of that whole system. If he had evoked his Romanness immediately, if he had escaped in the middle of the night during the earthquake, doing those things in secret or invoking his privilege immediately, that wouldn't have ever brought attention to his captors, to his oppressors. That would not have called anyone to account for the kinds of things that they do within this oppressive system. By staying and then being public and then not leaving town secretly, letting them just push it under the rug. He says, no, I want you to come and do this publicly. I want you to say you did this to a Roman citizen in the same way that you're doing this to all of these people. He's exposing not only the untruth of the accusation against him, but the inequity of how people with many different identities are treated. While I was spending time with all of these stories of enslavement and imprisonment this week, I also learned about a woman named Etty Hillesum. Is that name familiar to any of you? It wasn't to me. She was a Dutch Jewish woman, who lived in Holland during the First World War, or the Second World War, I'm sorry. So around the same time as Anne Frank was writing her journals, Eddie Hillesum, also a Dutch Jewish woman in Amsterdam, was writing journal entries and letters about her experience of being Jewish at that time. She was in her late 20s, and something like Paul, her faith gave her a kind of fearlessness. And unlike many of her compatriots, she refused to hide. She refused to hide or be suppressed or be cowed. Hillesum talks in her writing about being a sanctuary for the divine and the need to protect that spark, even though there was a risk to her own body, to her own physical well-being. From Westerbork, which was like a way station between, like, on the way to Auschwitz, she wrote this. At night, as I lay in the camp on my plank bed, I was sometimes filled with an infinite tenderness, and I prayed. Let me be the thinking heart of these barracks. That is what I want to be, the thinking heart of the whole concentration camp. Eventually, she was killed in Auschwitz. But she brought this real intention to her experience when she could have hidden. Instead, she wanted to be the hope and the minister to those who were around her. For a long time, I used my non-citizenship of the US as an excuse not to participate in risky civil disobedience kinds of actions, not to have to sign petitions, not to have to engage. I no longer have that excuse. Haven't had that excuse for 6 years. Although I did just reapply for my Canadian passport. I no longer have that excuse, and I've been thinking more and more about how I'm called at this stage of my life. What is mine to do with the identities that I hold? If I have any takeaways from this narrative, at least for myself, about enslavement and imprisonment, it is that indeed each of us is a sanctuary for the divine. Each one of us here, and each human, in captivity or no. That prophetic girl was a sanctuary for the divine. Paul and Silas were a sanctuary for the divine. Eddie Hillesum, the prisoners in Angola, each one of you, you're a sanctuary for God's Spirit. God dwells there. God's desire for each one of us, for each person alive, is for liberation. And we should be horrified. We should be horrified by the way that human bodies are commodified and violated and abused. And we should be horrified that the image of God is being defiled. When I am the most honest with myself, I can understand that my discipleship, that my membership in God's reign, is also calling me to do what I can with my human body to bring liberation to others. Even if sometimes it is because I am so haunted by God's children and so annoyed by people telling me that I should do the right thing, that I finally do the right thing. Even better when I can take that courage and act from conviction. May God bless me with this courage, and may God bless all of us to be called into liberative action.